The term commonplaces was coined by Greco-Roman rhetoricians, who compared them to public repositories of mental garbage, places where even the poorest of debaters could find a used tool to get them out of a tight spot against a more knowledgeable adversary. Every time someone resorts to one of these rhetorical crutches to give the impression of thought when no real thinking has occurred, everyone loses. The language is degraded, intelligence is cheapened, and public opinion is misled. That said, I don't mean to underestimate the power of these old weapons. The endless effectiveness of commonplaces, cliches, and ready-made phrases is not unlike that of a perpetual motion machine. The more worn out, the more persuasive, the more irrelevant to the topic, the more effective. Their greatest virtue lies precisely in diverting discussion from a difficult, poorly understood issue to the solid ground of familiar banalities, where conclusions are produced with the ease and automatism of bodily functions. The price, of course, is a complete evasion of the issue at hand. But who cares about that when all one wants is to make a good impression? There is no commonplace more common today than dismissing any criticism of leftism outright by claiming it stems from hate. More specifically, from visceral hate. You say that communists were responsible for the greatest genocides in history? Visceral hate. You point out that they created the Gulag and the Laogai, networks of concentration camps that surpassed even the Nazis' most macabre ambitions? Visceral hate. You complain that they suppressed the dissemination of their crimes? Visceral hate. After repeating this line a few hundred times, they'll have made you look worse than those who murdered 100 million people, imprisoned just as many, and now forbid you from even mentioning it. Come to think of it, you're the genocidal one. You're the tyrant. You're the monster. They merely killed a few million souls while preserving, through miraculous feats of rhetorical gymnastics, a radiant self-image as holy and well-meaning beings. Then you come along and, mercilessly, tear that image to shreds. You're cruel, man. You've got no love in your heart. The most curious part is that this kind of labeling comes from the very followers, sympathizers, and passive collaborators of an ideology that, behind closed doors, never bothered to hide its true motivations. Still echoing in these pages is the advice of Gorky, official writer of the Russian Revolution, quoted here last week, who instructed militants to develop physical repulsion for their enemies. Perhaps you also recall Bertolt Brecht's chilling remark that if the accused in the Moscow trials were innocent, then they especially deserved to be executed for the good of socialism. Maybe you've heard Eldridge Cleaver's declaration that raping white women was a revolutionary act. And perhaps still lingering in your memory is Che Guevara's famous maxim, calling for relentless hatred of the enemy. Hatred so violent it propels the revolutionary beyond the natural limits of man, turning him into a cold and efficient killing machine. But of course, none of these gentlemen said or did any of this out of hate. No, you're the hateful one, for telling people they said and did these things. It's by this peculiar communist logic that the World Social Forum, for instance, can proudly wave the banner of peace, by which it means the cessation of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, which killed a few hundred people, but not the Chinese occupation of Tibet, which has already claimed more than 1 million lives. When Orwell said that communists had invented a new language in which love is hate, peace is war, yes is no, and no is yes, he was not exaggerating in the slightest. Duplicity, diversion, camouflage, these lie at the very core of the communist soul. Anyone who, in debating communists or their fellow travelers, clings to the literal content of their words without recognizing that those words exist only to obscure the deeper logic of their actions is being played for a fool. Let me put it plainly, dear reader. If a visitor comes into your home with the clear intention of seducing your wife, under the pretext of playing cards, do you really believe the best course of action is to try and win the game? That's exactly how someone behaves when, facing political organizations deeply enmeshed in a continental revolutionary movement tied to drug trafficking, chooses to debate government programs and national solutions with them, as if this helped sustain a peaceful and democratic atmosphere of normalcy. For the revolutionary, every public statement, especially campaign rhetoric, is nothing more than a tool as disposable, as temporary, as a strip of toilet paper or a condom. The permanent conquest of power, the absolute control of the state, the total annihilation of all opposition. These remain, now as ever, the sole objectives of those who call themselves a new kind of leftist, supposedly converted to democracy, yet still openly complicit with the regime of Fidel Castro. These so-called Democrats continue to use the same old communist weapons, disguised as legitimate instruments of democratic process, inciting and legitimizing mob violence, while hysterically denouncing any response from their victims, dismantling the military, police, and judiciary from within and from above, manipulating and distorting the meaning of the law, controlling the media, the education system, the energy grid, and the nation's transportation networks, encouraging organized crime and then blaming it on capitalist society. To engage in economic or administrative debate with such imposters is to play a dirty game, to perform, in their carefully staged political pantomime, exactly the role they've scripted for their future victims. What must be done is not to argue policy, but to unmask them relentlessly. Behind their varied, contrived, and disorienting claims lies a single thread, the unwavering, ruthless logic of their strategy for conquest. For the same reason, trying to fight them with accusations of petty corruption, of the same sort they use so effectively to ruin their enemies, is useless. First, because the ideologically brainwashed portion of the electorate, which makes up their loyal voter base, feels no outrage over dishonest acts committed by their leaders, so long as these appear to serve the revolution. Second, because an organization fighting for a cause that is, at its core, evil, dishonest, and treacherous will always try to appear as clean and upstanding as possible in the day-to-day mechanics of politics, not only to avoid unnecessary problems, but also to maintain a deceptive aura of moral superiority. Nothing is more rigid than the internal moralism of mafias and revolutionary parties. No, the treachery of the left will never be defeated by timid, peripheral jabs. It must be struck at its heart, and that heart is strategy. Either we unmask it, or we resign ourselves to being ruled by a Pol Pot, a Fidel Castro, a Ceausescu.